like to start with this quote from Margaret Mead. When a person is born, we rejoice, and when they marry, we jubilate, but when they die, we try to pretend that nothing happened. Now, I don't know about you, but in my personal experience, this is what I've learned, that people just try to act like nothing happened. And I don't know if that's been yours, but it's very common, and we can feel very alone and isolated. So let's look at what happens when somebody dies, kind of what that's like for us. There's lots of different ways to view it, but I tend to think of it in about 4 steps. The first is when that person dies, we have that feeling of shock and numbness. There's always this surprise. Even if somebody's been sick for a long time and we know it's coming, we never think it's going to be this week. We never expect it to be today. And that always leaves us a little off kilter. But once we start moving from that intellectual understanding in our head of, yes, this person died, more to our hearts of feeling all that pain and yearning, that's when that second step comes in, that we're just overwhelmed sometimes. Now with this, there's often a desire to avoid all that pain because it can hurt so very much. We don't want to deal with it. We may want to go backwards to a happier time. We might want to flee it or avoid it. We might start doing things that are perhaps not necessarily in our best interest long term, but in the moment they feel good, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. And this is when we might want to keep telling our story over and over and over. And that's just one way to process that grief. However, when we do that, the people around us start looking at us like, she's already told me that 17 times. I think something's wrong with her. And people start worrying about us, but it's really just a normal part to want to repeat those stories about our loved ones because it hurts so much. And being able to share that with people helps a lot. Then the third part, which none of these are linear, we can go back and forth between all these steps. So it's not just a nice, neat progress from one to the next. The third is to adjust to what I call a new normal. Your life eventually gets back to some kind of normalcy, but it's not what you used to have. And this is where we start questioning, like, who am I? We might be kind of confused or quite distressed during this part when we're trying to figure all that out. And it's, I imagine for some, if your spouse has died, this might be the first time in your life you have ever lived alone. Perhaps. You moved from your parents' home to your spouse's. And so coming home to an empty house every day, what a huge change. Not to have somebody to wake up to, not to have somebody to go to bed with, not to have somebody to go run errands with every day. So that's all part of that journey, is learning how to cope and adjust to that. And then that fourth part is ultimately moving forward under these changed circumstances. Now, I like to envision this when somebody first dies, the color goes out of life. It's all just black and white and a lot of gray. But at this point, kind of the color starts coming back. We enjoy things like we used to, perhaps, and we don't feel guilty about it. We might enjoy it earlier in the process. However, we often feel guilty because we're not feeling bad about the loss of our loved one at that particular moment. When we finally get to that end stage there, we're once again that doesn't weigh quite so heavily on us, because at this point we finally figured out how to maintain some relationship with that loved one where we can go forward and live our lives in a new way. It's more of a spiritual relationship, perhaps, rather than having that physical presence there. So I view the journey of grief is not about finding answers, but how to learn to live with unanswered questions.